New Mexico receives $3.42 from Washington for every $1 its residents send back in federal taxes. That is the highest return of any state in the country. It also has the highest property crime rate, the third highest violent crime rate, the worst-ranked public school system, and the second highest poverty rate in the nation. In the decade between 2015 and 2025, while the national population grew by more than 6%, New Mexico's grew by 1.4. Deaths now outnumber births. More Americans leave the state each year than move into it. The only thing that has kept New Mexico's population from outright collapse is immigration, and in 2025, even that fell by 73%. A state that the federal government funds more generously than any other has somehow produced one of the poorest, most dangerous, and most rapidly emptying places in America. The question is not what went wrong. The question is whether anything was ever set up to go right. The land that is now New Mexico has been continuously inhabited longer than almost any place in what would become the United States. The Pueblo people built stone and adobe settlements along the Rio Grande and its tributaries centuries before any European arrived, irrigating fields of corn and squash in a landscape that receives, in most places, less than 15 inches of rain a year. By the time the Spanish came north from Mexico in 1598, the Pueblo communities had been farming those river valleys for generations. The Spanish did not come looking for farmland. They came looking for gold, the fabled 7 cities of Cibola. And when they found none, they stayed anyway, because the Crown wanted a buffer against whatever rival might try to claim the territory. From its very first day as a colony, New Mexico existed not for its own sake, but for someone else's strategic interest. Spain governed New Mexico for nearly 250 years, longer than the United States has existed as a country. And the system it built was unlike anything the Anglo-American world would later construct in the West. The Spanish Crown issued land grants, not to individuals buying parcels at auction, but to communities. A village would receive a grant that included small irrigated plots for each family along the river, with the surrounding hills, forests, and grazing land held in common. It was a communal system, closer in spirit to a medieval European village than to the homestead model that would later define the American frontier. At the peak of Spanish and then Mexican rule, nearly 300 such grants existed across New Mexico and into southern Colorado, encompassing tens of thousands of square miles. Those grants were not just parcels of real estate. They were the entire economic and social architecture of a civilization. The acequia irrigation ditches, the grazing commons, the timber stands, the village plazas where trade and governance happened together. They worked because they were designed for the specific conditions of the high desert: scarce water, vast distances, cooperative survival. In 1680, something happened in New Mexico that happened nowhere else in North America. The Pueblo people revolted against Spanish rule and won. A medicine man named Popé from the Tewa-speaking pueblo of Oke-Owinje coordinated an uprising across dozens of communities spread over hundreds of miles. Communities that spoke 6 different languages and had no shared political structure. The coordination was accomplished through runners carrying knotted cords that counted down the days to the attack. The Spanish intercepted some of the runners and moved the date up, but the revolt succeeded anyway. The Pueblo fighters killed 400 colonists and 21 Franciscan priests, burned the churches, destroyed the Spanish records, and drove every remaining Spaniard out of the territory all the way south to El Paso. For 12 years, New Mexico was free of European control, the only successful, large-scale indigenous revolt against a colonial power in the history of the continent. When the Spanish returned in 1693 under Diego de Vargas, they came back differently. The reconquest was partly military, partly negotiated, and the colony that emerged was more accommodating of Pueblo autonomy than the one that had been destroyed. Spain confirmed Pueblo land grants alongside Hispanic ones. The Pueblos retained their land, their governance, and much of their religious practice. a concession the Spanish made almost nowhere else in the Americas. A hybrid culture developed over the following century and a half. Spanish, Pueblo, and eventually Genízaro, the detribalized indigenous people who settled in frontier villages as buffers against Comanche and Apache raids. By the time Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821 and inherited the province, New Mexico had a cultural identity that was already 3 centuries old and belonged to neither the Anglo-American world nor fully to Mexico. It was its own thing, and that fact would shape everything that followed, because the United States never quite knew what to do with it. The Americans arrived in 1846 during the Mexican-American War, when General Stephen Kearny marched into Santa Fe and took the territory without firing a shot. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, ceded New Mexico to the United States and made a specific promise: the property rights of the existing population would be respected. The Spanish and Mexican land grants would be honored. That promise lasted about as long as it took for the first American lawyers to arrive. What happened next is one of the great land thefts in American history, and it was accomplished not with guns, but with paperwork. The United States operated under Anglo-American property law, individual title, fee simple, recorded deeds. The Spanish and Mexican grants operated under an entirely different legal tradition, where communal land was held collectively. Boundaries were described by natural landmarks rather than surveyed coordinates, and much of the documentation had been destroyed in the Pueblo revolt of 1680. Into this gap stepped a group of Anglo-American attorneys and politicians who came to be known as the Santa Fe Ring. Their leader was Thomas Catron, a former Confederate officer from Missouri who arrived in New Mexico after the Civil War and saw, in the confusion of 2 colliding legal systems, the opportunity of a lifetime. Catron's method was elegant in its ruthlessness. He would identify a land grant, buy up shares from individual heirs, who often did not understand that their share of communal land could be sold as private property, then file partition suits to dissolve the common ownership. Where the legal path was unclear, he used his political connections. He served as Territorial Attorney General, Territorial Delegate to Congress, President of the Bar Association, Mayor of Santa Fe, and eventually one of New Mexico's first 2 United States Senators. By the 1890s, Catron personally held title to, or financial interest in, 34 land grants, covering approximately 3 million acres, making him, by some accounts, the largest private landowner in the United States. The county that bears his name today is one of the biggest in the state by area, and one of the smallest by population. A fitting monument to a man who valued acreage over people. The scale of the dispossession is staggering. Hispanic and Pueblo families who had held land for generations, in some cases since the 1690s, lost an estimated 98% of their grant lands to Anglo speculators. The Court of Private Land Claims, established by Congress in 1891 to adjudicate the grants, rejected far more claims than it confirmed, and the claims it did confirm were often reduced to a fraction of their original size. A system of communal land tenure that had sustained communities for 2 centuries was dismantled in 2 decades. The dispossession did not go unanswered. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, a secret organization called Las Gorras Blancas, the Whitecaps, rode through San Miguel County at night, cutting the barbed wire fences that Anglo ranchers had strung across former common lands, burning haystacks and tearing up railroad ties. They were not outlaws in any conventional sense. They were villagers, farmers and shepherds, who understood that the privatization of the commons was an existential threat to their communities. They posted manifestos on fence posts, written in Spanish, declaring that the land belonged to the people and not to the corporations. The movement had ties to the Knights of Labor and to the nascent Populist Party. It was, in its way, one of the earliest organized labor actions in the American West. But the fences went back up, and the courts continued to rule in favor of the speculators, and the villages survived only in diminished form. The grazing commons gone, the timber gone, the water increasingly contested. That loss echoes through every poverty statistic New Mexico has produced since. And while the land was being taken, Washington was refusing to let New Mexico govern itself. The territory applied for statehood in 1850, the same year California was admitted. Congress said no. The first rejection was tangled in the slavery debate. Southern senators objected to New Mexico's proposed anti-slavery constitution. Then came the Civil War, which reached New Mexico directly. In 1862, a Confederate force under General Henry Hopkins Sibley invaded from Texas, marching up the Rio Grande with the ambition of seizing the territory, its mineral wealth, and eventually a corridor to the Pacific. Sibley had assumed the Hispanic population would welcome the Confederates. He miscalculated badly. New Mexicans remembered the Texas invasion of 1841 and the border disputes that followed. At the Battle of Glorieta Pass in the mountains east of Santa Fe, Union troops and Colorado volunteers destroyed the Confederate supply train, ending the invasion. It was called the Gettysburg of the West, and it ensured that New Mexico would remain in Union hands, though not for another 50 years as a state. New Mexico applied for statehood again after the war, and again. Over the next half-century, more than 4 dozen statehood bills were introduced in Congress. Every one failed. New Mexico was a territory longer than any other contiguous state in the Union, and the reasons were not subtle. Congressional opponents said it plainly. The territory's population was majority Catholic, majority Spanish-speaking, and therefore unfit for self-governance. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, who chaired the Committee on Territories, visited in 1902 and reported back that the people of New Mexico were essentially foreign, that they could not speak English, could not read their own constitution, and had no business joining the Republic as equal partners. This from a country that had just admitted Nevada, with a population smaller than a mid-sized eastern town, primarily to secure its silver tax revenue and its electoral votes. The irony is that 2 of the most powerful forces in New Mexico's economy, the mining industry and the railroads, actually preferred territorial status. As a territory, New Mexico had no state taxation. Mines and railroads operated under federal oversight that was lighter and more distant than any state legislature would have been. Statehood threatened their bottom line. So while Congress was blocking New Mexico on cultural grounds, the territory's largest employers were quietly lobbying to keep it that way. The railroad, when it came, performed one of those small acts of infrastructure routing that reshapes a state forever. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was named in part for Santa Fe. It was organized in 1859 specifically to connect Kansas to the capital of New Mexico. But when the line reached New Mexico in the late 1870s, the terrain into Santa Fe proved too steep and too expensive. The railroad's engineers proposed building into Santa Fe anyway, for a price. The city fathers of Santa Fe, assuming the railroad had no choice but to come to them, refused to pay the standard incentive. So the Santa Fe Railroad, the one with Santa Fe in its name, bypassed Santa Fe entirely and built its main line through Albuquerque instead. Santa Fe got a branch line from the tiny junction town of Lamy, 18 miles away. Albuquerque got the main yards, the repair shops, the freight depot, and eventually between 1/3 and 1/2 of its working men employed by the railroad. That single decision, a negotiation that collapsed over money, is the reason Albuquerque is a city of 500,000 today and Santa Fe is a town of 90,000. It is also the reason Santa Fe preserved its historic adobe character while Albuquerque grew into a sprawling, modern, unremarkable western metro. Both cities are still living inside the consequences of one deal that didn't close in 1880. The railroad brought something else that would reshape New Mexico in ways nobody anticipated: sick people. Between 1880 and 1940, thousands of tuberculosis patients traveled west, seeking the dry, high-altitude air that doctors believed could heal diseased lungs. They were called lungers, and they came in such numbers that by 1920, An estimated 20% of New Mexico's entire population consisted of health seekers and their families. Albuquerque's Central Avenue was known as Lunger's Alley for the sanatoriums that lined it. 60 hospitals, camps, and treatment facilities operated across the state. The New Mexico Bureau of Immigration, a body created to advocate for statehood, actively marketed the territory as the heart of the well country because the Lungers were predominantly white, English-speaking Easterners, and their presence was the strongest argument New Mexico could make to a skeptical Congress that the territory was becoming sufficiently American. The strategy, in a way, worked. New Mexico was finally admitted as the 47th state on January 6, 1912, and the Constitution its delegates wrote was unlike any other in the country. It was, in a sense, a document of defiance dressed in the language of compromise. The framers embedded the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo directly into the Bill of Rights. They guaranteed that the right to vote, hold office, and sit on juries could never be restricted on account of language, that inability to speak English could not disqualify a citizen from participation. They mandated bilingual education in public schools. They required that children of Spanish descent enjoy perfect equality with other children and never be placed in separate schools. And then they locked these provisions behind an amendment threshold so high it has never been met. 3/4 of all voters statewide and 2/3 in every county must approve any change. New Mexico is the only state in the nation with a constitutional commitment to the Spanish language. In 1912, while southern states were writing Jim Crow into law, New Mexico was writing linguistic and cultural protections into a constitution designed to be nearly impossible to undo. But a constitution, however well crafted, cannot substitute for an economy, and New Mexico in 1912 had the same problem it had always had. The wealth beneath its soil belonged, in practice, to someone else. The cattle and sheep industries were dominated by large Anglo-owned ranches operating on land that had recently been communal. The railroads were owned in Kansas and New York. The mines, silver at Mogollon, copper at Santa Rita, coal at Madrid and Raton, were owned by Eastern capital. New Mexico produced raw materials and shipped them out. The profits accumulated elsewhere. The state's first oil well was drilled in 1922 on Navajo land in the San Juan Basin in the northwestern corner. And from the start, the oil companies were headquartered somewhere else. What New Mexico did develop in the early 20th century was an economy of a different and peculiar kind. It sold its own strangeness. Artists began arriving in Taos and Santa Fe before the First World War, drawn by the same light and landscape that had drawn the Lungers, and by the Pueblo and Hispanic cultures that seemed, to Eastern eyes, exotically timeless. The art colonies attracted writers, then tourists, then the dealers and galleries and hotels that tourists require. Santa Fe began to cultivate its adobe aesthetic as a commercial asset. The same buildings and plazas that had once been evidence of Spanish backwardness in the eyes of congressmen who denied statehood became evidence of authentic charm worth traveling to see. It was a genuine industry, and it endures, but it was also, in a sense, another form of extraction. The culture of the state's oldest communities commodified for the consumption of visitors from wealthier places. The state entered the mid-20th century still poor, still dependent, still waiting for someone to arrive and tell it what it was for. And then someone did. In early 1943, the town of Los Alamos did not exist. It did not appear on any map. The site, on the Pajarito Plateau in the Jemez Mountains northwest of Santa Fe, had been a boys' ranch school, isolated, pristine, the kind of place where young men lived and studied in wilderness conditions. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist chosen to direct the Manhattan Project's weapons laboratory, had spent summers at a cabin nearby. He knew the landscape, remote enough for secrecy, high enough for clear air, empty enough for an operation that would eventually employ 6,000 people on a mesa that officially did not exist. The Army bought the ranch school, evicted the students, and began building a secret city behind barbed wire. The site bordered the San Ildefonso Pueblo, whose people would later discover that hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of radioactive waste had been stored at a facility called Area G, adjacent to their land. No one from Los Alamos formally consulted with any of the neighboring pueblos about the laboratory's impact until the 1990s, half a century after the first chain reaction experiments. Scientists and their families lived in hastily constructed housing. Security was so tight that a 5-year-old girl whose brother smashed her thumb with a rock was refused entry to the base hospital because she lacked clearance. Mail was censored. The town had no civilian government. Birth certificates listed the baby's birthplace as P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the first atomic bomb was detonated at the Trinity site in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, 200 miles south of Los Alamos, on what is now White Sands Missile Range. The blast created a crater a half-mile wide and fused the desert sand into a glassy substance that would later be named trinitite. The flash was visible from 160 miles away. A rancher's widow, living 40 miles from the site, thought the sun had come up in the wrong direction. The world changed that morning, and New Mexico changed with it. But not the way the rest of the world did. For the world, the bomb was a geopolitical fact. For New Mexico, it was an economic one. Los Alamos National Laboratory never closed. It became a permanent installation. And over the following decades, it grew into the economic backbone of northern New Mexico. By the 21st century, the lab employed nearly 12,000 people, paid out more than $1 billion a year in salaries, and generated an annual economic impact on the state estimated at $3.1 billion. 13% of the residents of surrounding communities work directly at the lab. Another 30% work for contractors tied to it. Today, Los Alamos County has the highest median household income in New Mexico, over $103,000, in a state where the median household income is roughly $50,000. The county is, in effect, a federal enclave, wealthy, educated, secure, and utterly dependent on decisions made in Washington about nuclear weapons budgets. 60 miles south in Albuquerque, a parallel story unfolded. Sandia National Laboratories, established after the war to handle the engineering of nuclear weapons, grew into another massive federal installation, generating another $3 billion a year in economic activity. Kirtland Air Force Base, adjacent to Sandia, houses the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center. White Sands Missile Range, at 3,200 square miles, is the largest military installation in the contiguous United States. Holloman Air Force Base and Cannon Air Force Base add further military payrolls. Together, New Mexico's military installations contribute more than $5 billion annually and employ approximately 25,000 people. In southern New Mexico, military spending accounts for 30% of all wages. The federal government did not just build facilities in New Mexico. It became the state's economy, and it did so in a way that created prosperity in specific, narrow corridors. Los Alamos County, the neighborhoods around Kirtland, the towns near White Sands, while leaving the rest of the state largely untouched. The physicists' Mesa and the Shepherd's Valley exist in the same state, 50 miles apart, separated by a century of income. The bomb also created a demand for uranium, and New Mexico had it. In 1950, a Navajo shepherd named Paddy Martinez found a yellowish rock near the town of Grants in western New Mexico. It was uranium ore, and the discovery triggered a rush. The Federal Atomic Energy Commission had already announced it would guarantee prices for domestically mined uranium, and the Grants mineral belt turned out to be one of the richest deposits in the country. By the mid-1950s, hundreds of mines were operating across the Colorado Plateau, and many of them, concentrated in northwestern New Mexico, were on or near Navajo land. The Navajo, Acoma, and Laguna peoples negotiated royalty agreements that required the use of local workers, and thousands of indigenous miners went underground. They dug ore with picks, loaded it into wheelbarrows, and hauled it out of tunnels with no ventilation and no protective equipment. Mine safety circulars of the era made no mention of radiation exposure. The Navajo language had no word for radiation. By the 1950s, miners were dying of lung cancer at catastrophic rates. They called the sickness red lungs for what they coughed up, or uranium on the lungs. The Navajo word for uranium ore, litzo, the yellow monster, acquired a meaning that had nothing to do with geology. The boom lasted roughly 3 decades. By the 1960s, the government stockpiles were full, and subsidies began to taper. By the 1980s, the industry had collapsed entirely. Grants, which had called itself the uranium capital of the world, emptied out. The State Mining Division lists 259 uranium production mines and 400 exploration sites in the Grants Belt. Of those 259 mines, 137 have no record of any cleanup work whatsoever. In 1979, at Church Rock, a dam holding uranium mill tailings broke and released more than 1,000 tons of radioactive waste and 93 million gallons of contaminated water into the Puerco River. It was the largest release of radioactive material in United States history, larger than 3 Mile Island, which had occurred just 4 months earlier and received vastly more national attention. The Puerco River flowed through Navajo communities. Livestock drank from it. Children played near it. The Church Rock spill has never been fully cleaned up. The pattern is ancient and unmistakable. An outside interest identifies something valuable in New Mexico's earth. It extracts that value, with local labor under local skies, and the profits flow elsewhere. When the resource is exhausted or the price drops, the operation shuts down and the consequences remain. Silver in the 19th century, cattle on stolen grant land, uranium in the 20th. The land is always the same land. The people living on it are always the ones left with the residue. And now, oil. New Mexico's portion of the Permian Basin, concentrated in Lee and Eddy counties in the state's southeast corner, has transformed the state's finances in a single decade. The Permian Basin is the most productive oil field on the planet, spanning roughly 250 miles wide and 300 miles long, larger than the state of Florida, and straddling the Texas-New Mexico border. On the New Mexico side, oil production surpassed 2 million barrels per day in 2024, more than doubling 2019 output. The growth rate has exceeded even Texas, the nation's leading producer. Oil and gas revenue quadrupled between fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2023, when the industry generated more than $15 billion in state income, $6.6 billion in taxes, and another $8.6 billion from land income. The state's general fund is now roughly 35 to 40% dependent on oil and gas money. About half of that revenue goes directly to public schools, over $800 million a year for primary and secondary education alone. The numbers are extraordinary, but the geography is telling. Of the 1,500 oil and gas wells drilled in New Mexico in a recent year, 96%, 1,436 of them, were in Eddy and Lee counties. Those 2 counties, with about 6% of the state's population, contribute approximately 20% of its tax revenue. 300 miles northwest, in the old land-grant villages of Rio Arriba County, where the acequia ditches still run and the poverty rate hovers near 30%, the oil boom is an abstraction, something that shows up as a line item in the state budget, but not as a job or a paycheck. The oil money has done real things. The state has invested in early childhood care, expanded Medicaid, funded infrastructure, and built a permanent fund modeled on the sovereign wealth funds of petrostates. But the structural problem remains. The wealth is extractive, it is geographically concentrated, and it is subject to the same commodity price volatility that has destroyed every previous resource boom in the state's history. The Legislative Finance Committee has warned repeatedly that relying on oil revenue is like building a house on a commodity futures contract. And the companies doing the drilling are not headquartered in New Mexico. They are in Houston, in Midland, in Dallas. The pattern holds. Meanwhile, the rest of the state's economy, the part not sustained by federal laboratories, military bases, or oil wells, struggles in ways that would be considered a crisis in any other context. New Mexico's poverty rate has hovered between 15 and 20% for at least 20 years, consistently ranking among the 2 or 3 worst in the nation. Nearly a quarter of the state's children live in poverty. The median household income is the 3rd lowest in the country. The state spent more than $10 billion in state and federal funds on income support programs in a single fiscal year, and the poverty rate didn't move. Workforce participation is chronically below the national average, and as of a recent report, there were 49,000 unfilled jobs in the state, alongside one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. People who want work can't find it. Employers who want workers can't find them. Something in the machinery is broken at a level deeper than any single policy can reach. The schools are where the breakage shows most starkly. New Mexico has been ranked last or next to last in public education by virtually every major assessment for years. Only 19% of 4th graders demonstrate proficiency in reading. Students receive the lowest average SAT scores of any state. The high school graduation rate, 71%, is the worst in the nation. Spending has increased substantially, rising by about a third between 2018 and 2023 to roughly $3,800 more per pupil. Test scores have not followed. A landmark lawsuit, Martinez-Yazzie, resulted in a court ruling that the state had failed its constitutional obligation to provide a sufficient education for at-risk students, many of them the English language learners whose rights the 1911 Constitution was specifically designed to protect. The court gave the state until April 2019 to resolve the deficiencies. The deficiencies remain. There is an almost unbearable irony in the fact that Los Alamos, the federal enclave, the government town, the place where some of the most brilliant physicists in American history were recruited to live, sits in a state with the worst schools in the country. Los Alamos County's children attend well-funded schools in a wealthy community. The children in Gallup, 60 miles from the Navajo Nation's capital, and in the county with the highest rate of alcohol-related deaths in New Mexico, attend schools in a community where the violent crime rate exceeds 1,300 per 100,000. The physicist's child and the shepherd's grandchild are both New Mexicans. Their state constitutions are identical. Their lives are not. Crime, the statistic that gives the state its grim superlative, is not evenly distributed any more than wealth is. Albuquerque, the state's largest city, has for years ranked among the worst large American cities for property crime and auto theft, though recent aggressive policing has produced double-digit drops in homicides and robberies. Gallup, a commercial hub for surrounding rural communities and the Navajo Nation, has the highest violent crime rate in the state. Belen, a small town south of Albuquerque along Interstate 25, has the second highest. Officials point to its location on a major highway corridor, limited economic opportunity, and substance abuse, the same triad of explanations that appears in nearly every high-crime community in New Mexico. Fentanyl and methamphetamine have compounded a substance abuse problem that was already severe. Las Cruces, a college town near the Mexican border, saw a 46% year-over-year increase in violent crime in 2024, and the police chief attributed it directly to drugs. But crime in New Mexico is not a phenomenon that appeared recently and can be solved with the right policy package. It is an expression of the same structural condition that produces the poverty, the educational failure, and the outmigration. A state where a third of the budget comes from oil pumped in 2 counties, where another large share comes from federal spending on nuclear weapons and military bases, and where the remaining revenue is assembled from the thin tax base of a population that is among the poorest in America. That state does not have an economy designed to employ its people. It has an economy designed to extract from its land and maintain its installations. The people are incidental to both. There is no Fortune 500 company headquartered in New Mexico. There is no major financial center, no significant manufacturing base, no port, no navigable river. The University of New Mexico and New Mexico State University produce graduates, many of whom leave for Colorado, Texas, and Arizona, where the private sector jobs are. The state's largest employers are the federal government, the state government, the university hospitals, and the school systems. Almost every significant source of income in New Mexico is, in one way or another, public money. The population numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 2020 and 2025, New Mexico lost more than 10,500 people to domestic outmigration, Americans leaving for other states. Deaths exceeded births by nearly 11,500. The only thing that kept the population from shrinking outright was the arrival of roughly 30,000 international migrants over the same period, and even that was not growth so much as replacement, filling gaps in a labor force that the state's own residents were abandoning. When immigration fell sharply in 2025, driven by federal policy changes that reduced international migration to New Mexico by 73% in a single year, the math stopped working. New Mexico was one of only 5 states in the country to lose population that year, alongside California, Hawaii, Vermont, and West Virginia. Every one of its neighbors, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, has grown faster, in some cases dramatically so. Utah's population grew by more than 15% in the same decade that New Mexico managed 1.4. The state is not just poor and dangerous. It is becoming less populated, which, in a democracy where political representation and federal funding are tied to headcounts, means it is becoming less powerful, too. 428 years after the first Spanish soldiers walked up the Rio Grande looking for gold they would never find, the fundamental condition of New Mexico has not changed as much as it might appear. The land is still claimed in one way or another by distant authorities: the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, the oil companies in Houston. The wealth beneath the surface still flows outward. The communities that have lived on this land the longest are still the poorest. The acequia ditches still carry water through villages in Rio Arriba County, past adobe houses whose walls were built from the same earth they irrigate, in a system of communal management that predates the United States by a century and a half. The ditches still work. The villages still function in their way. It is the state, the American state, the structure imposed in 1850, delayed until 1912, funded by Washington and dependent on Washington, enriched by its oil and emptied by its poverty, that does not. In Los Alamos, the median household earns over $100,000, and the crime rate is among the lowest in the state. The laboratory's budget has grown in recent years as part of a $1 trillion nuclear modernization program. The town is hiring. 60 miles south, on the winding road that descends through the Jemez Mountains toward the Rio Grande, the landscape opens into the valley where the old land grants once spread from river to ridge, where the common grazing lands were taken, where the villages thinned, where the children leave. The cottonwoods along the river are the same cottonwoods. The mesa above is the same mesa. The light, everyone agrees, is extraordinary, that particular quality of high desert light that has drawn painters and photographers and tourists for 100 years. The light that earns New Mexico its official name, the Land of Enchantment. The light falls on everything equally. Nothing else does.